Australia was never supposed to become a country. At least, not like this. To Britain, it was little more than a solution to a growing problem. A distant, hostile land at the edge of the world, a place to send criminals nobody wanted. But what began as a desperate imperial experiment somehow became one of the wealthiest and most stable countries on Earth. So how did a prison colony become modern Australia? To understand Australia, we first need to understand Britain in the late 18th century. And Britain had a serious problem. Actually, several. The country was changing faster than society could handle. Cities were growing rapidly. Poverty was everywhere. The Industrial Revolution was transforming daily life, forcing thousands into overcrowded urban centers where jobs were unstable, living conditions were brutal, and survival itself often felt uncertain. Crime exploded. Not necessarily violent crime, but theft, petty crime, desperation. People stole food, clothes, small valuables, sometimes simply to survive. And Britain responded the only way it knew how: punishment. A lot of punishment. The legal system of the time was famously brutal. In 18th century Britain, people could be imprisoned for crimes that today might barely result in a fine. Stealing bread, taking fabric, small thefts. Even cutting down trees in certain areas could lead to severe punishment. By modern standards, it sounds absurd, but Britain was terrified of disorder. Authorities believed harsh punishment kept society stable. And soon, prisons began overflowing. There were simply too many people. So many, in fact, that Britain started doing something extraordinary. They began keeping prisoners on old abandoned warships. These floating prisons, known as prison hulks, were anchored near ports and packed with inmates. Conditions were horrific. Disease spread quickly. Food was poor. Violence was common. For many prisoners, survival itself became uncertain, and Britain desperately needed a long-term solution. But the truth is, Britain already had one. For decades, criminals had been quietly shipped overseas, not to Australia, to America. Long before Australia existed as a British colony, Britain had been exporting convicts across the Atlantic. Between the early 1700s and the American Revolution, tens of thousands of prisoners were transported to Britain's colonies in North America. For Britain, it was a perfect system. The prisons emptied. The colonies gained cheap labor, and society back home felt safer. Problem solved. Or at least, it seemed solved. Because then Britain made one catastrophic mistake. It lost America. The American Revolution changed everything. When Britain lost the colonies in 1783, it didn't just lose land. It lost its dumping ground. Suddenly, the entire transportation system collapsed. Convicts had nowhere to go. And meanwhile, the crisis back home only grew worse. Prisons became even more overcrowded. Prison hulks filled with desperate inmates. Fear spread among politicians. Some believed Britain was heading toward social collapse. Crime was rising. Cities were unstable. And the government needed a new answer fast. But finding another America was not easy. Britain explored different options. Africa was considered. Canada seemed impractical. Some politicians even proposed simply building more prisons. But none of these ideas solved the immediate crisis. Then attention turned to a place few Europeans truly understood. A land so distant that it almost seemed unreal. Australia. At the time, Britain knew very little about it. Captain James Cook had mapped parts of the eastern coast only years earlier. To Europeans, it was remote, mysterious, and unimaginably far away. The journey alone would take more than 8 months. The climate was unknown. The land seemed hostile, and no one could guarantee survival. Sending thousands of prisoners there sounded insane. But to Britain, desperation changes what sounds reasonable. Because by the 1780s, Australia no longer looked impossible. It looked useful. A distant place where Britain could remove unwanted people. A strategic foothold in the Pacific. And perhaps, eventually, something even more valuable. So Britain made a decision that would change history. They would build an entirely new colony on the other side of the planet. But there was one problem. Australia wasn't empty. And what happened next would become far darker than Britain expected. In 1787, Britain finally put its plan into motion. 11 ships gathered at Portsmouth. Together, they became known as the First Fleet. On board were over 1,000 people. Convicts, soldiers, officials, supplies, and one impossible mission: to create a functioning colony at the edge of the known world. For most of the prisoners, this was not just exile. It felt like a death sentence. Many had no idea where Australia even was. Some believed they would never survive the journey. Others assumed they would simply disappear forever, forgotten by the empire. And honestly, that fear wasn't unreasonable. The voyage itself was brutal. The ships traveled across dangerous oceans for more than 8 months. Food spoiled. Disease spread. Space was painfully limited. Storms threatened entire sections of the fleet. And yet, despite everything, something surprising happened. Far fewer prisoners died than expected. This was unusual. Prison transport at the time often ended in catastrophe. But the British government had learned a lesson from previous failures. Dead prisoners were useless. Healthy workers mattered. After all, Australia wasn't just meant to be punishment. It was meant to function. Britain wasn't simply abandoning criminals. It was trying to build something. The problem was, no one really knew what exactly they were building. When the fleet finally arrived in January 1788, reality hit immediately. Australia was nothing like Britain imagined. The first landing point, Botany Bay, looked disappointing. The soil seemed poor. Fresh water was limited. Farming prospects looked terrible. And suddenly, the empire's grand plan began to feel dangerously fragile. Because this wasn't America. There were no developed colonial towns. No existing infrastructure. No easy trade routes. No certainty. Just unfamiliar land and enormous risk. Governor Arthur Phillip quickly made a decision. The fleet moved north to a better harbor, a place now known as Sydney Cove. At first glance, it seemed promising. Deep water, a natural harbor, better conditions. But survival remained uncertain. The colony struggled almost immediately. Food shortages became constant. Supplies ran dangerously low. The land was unfamiliar. European farming methods failed. Even basic survival became difficult. For months, hunger hovered over the settlement. And the convicts the people Britain had sent away as disposable suddenly became essential. The empire needed workers, builders, farmers, laborers. Without them, the colony simply wouldn't survive. Ironically, the very people Britain wanted to get rid of became the foundation of Australia itself. But survival wasn't the only problem, because Britain had built this colony on land that already belonged to someone else. Long before British ships arrived, Australia had been home to indigenous peoples for tens of thousands of years. Complex societies existed across the continent. Languages, trade networks, spiritual systems, cultures deeply connected to the land. To British settlers, however, much of this was ignored. Colonial authorities treated the territory as if it belonged to no one. A legal idea later known as terra nullius. Essentially, land belonging to nobody. In reality, of course, it wasn't empty. And as settlers expanded, Conflict became inevitable. Tensions slowly turned violent. Land was taken. Communities were displaced. Disease spread rapidly. And over time, entire indigenous populations suffered devastating losses. This part of Australia's story is uncomfortable, but impossible to ignore, because the country Britain accidentally built came at an enormous human cost. And yet, despite famine, isolation, conflict, and uncertainty, the colony somehow survived. In fact, something unexpected was beginning to happen. Australia was no longer just a prison. Slowly, almost accidentally, it was becoming a society. And Britain had no idea what it had just started. At first, Australia had one purpose: punishment. Britain never intended this distant colony to become a thriving nation. It was simply meant to remove unwanted people from society. A prison at the edge of the world. But history has a strange habit of ignoring original plans. Because over time, something unexpected began to happen. The colony started changing. Convicts who completed their sentences didn't always return to Britain. Many stayed. Some became workers. Others became landowners. Small settlements slowly expanded. Trade increased. Agriculture improved. And despite years of hardship, Australia slowly became more stable. In a strange twist of history, the people Britain had once considered disposable began building entirely new communities. Former prisoners became farmers, merchants, builders, business owners, and in some cases, very wealthy. The empire's prison experiment was quietly transforming into something much bigger. Then came another turning point: gold. In the 1850s, massive gold discoveries changed Australia forever. News spread quickly across the world. Suddenly, thousands of migrants began arriving. Not prisoners, free people, workers, dreamers, fortune seekers. The population exploded. Cities expanded rapidly. Money poured into the colonies. And almost overnight, Australia began evolving from a distant outpost into something economically powerful. The irony was impossible to ignore. Britain had created Australia to get rid of criminals. Instead, it accidentally helped create one of the richest societies in the world. But Australia wasn't simply becoming wealthier. It was becoming something else. Independent. At least, slowly. Over time, Australians began developing their own identity. Still British, but different. More informal. More rebellious. More skeptical of authority. After all, when a country begins with prisoners, survival, and isolation, you don't end up thinking exactly like the empire that created you. And yet, Britain's influence never truly disappeared. Even today, Australia still carries deep marks of its colonial past. The language, the legal system, parliament, political institutions, cultural traditions, even the monarchy. Technically, Australia still recognizes the British monarch as head of state. More than 2 centuries later, the empire's shadow still lingers. And perhaps that's the strangest part of the story. Australia was never meant to become what it is today. Britain never sat down and carefully designed a future wealthy democracy in the Pacific. There was no brilliant master plan, no long-term strategy for building one of the most prosperous countries in the modern world. Only desperation, overcrowded prisons, fear of rising crime, and an empire scrambling to solve a problem after losing America. At the time, Australia looked like a gamble, a backup plan, a distant punishment colony so remote that many believed survival itself was impossible. And honestly, by all logic, it probably shouldn't have worked. The journey was brutal. The land unfamiliar, food scarce, conflict unavoidable, isolation extreme. For years, the colony stood dangerously close to failure. Yet somehow, against enormous odds, it survived, then expanded, then prospered. But the story of Australia is more complicated than simple success. Because modern Australia was built through contradiction, opportunity and suffering, growth and displacement, freedom for some, devastation for others. A country shaped by convicts, built through colonization, and transformed by migration, ambition, and survival. That complexity matters. Because history is rarely clean. Countries are not usually built through perfect decisions or genius plans. Sometimes, nations emerge from mistakes, from political desperation, from unintended consequences, from problems powerful people were simply trying to get rid of. Australia exists because Britain had a crisis. And in trying to solve it, Britain accidentally built a country